In the mist-covered Carpathians, a forgotten war raged long after Europe's victory parades had ended, a war the Soviets tried to erase and the West never saw. On Lopata Hill, Ukrainian insurgents faced an empire they could not defeat, yet refused to surrender to. What really happened in those forests? And why did this battle become the secret that shaped a nation's memory? The summer of 1944 brought the Carpathians to the forefront of a complex and violent struggle for control over western Ukraine. As the Red Army advanced westward during its Lviv-Sandomierz offensive, the strategic ridge of Lopata Hill, near the village of Losyatin in the Carpathian foothills, became the focal point of one of the Ukrainian insurgent army's most intense battles. To the Soviet command, this region was an obstacle on the path toward liberating Eastern Europe from German occupation. To the UPA, it was the heart of their homeland, a bastion they sought to defend against both Soviet and Polish forces who threatened to erase their vision of an independent Ukraine. The geopolitical background of this conflict was defined by overlapping ambitions and betrayals. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Ukraine's western territories, previously part of Poland before 1939, had experienced shifting occupations, first Soviet, then German. Each new regime brought its own terror. The NKVD's mass arrests and deportations of 1940-41 were followed by the Gestapo's executions and forced labor policies. Amid this chaos, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, evolved from a clandestine political movement into a militant force. Its armed branch, the UPA, formally emerged in late 1942 as both an anti-German and anti-Soviet resistance army, determined to build an independent Ukrainian state through armed struggle. By 1943, the UPA controlled vast areas of Volhynia and parts of Galicia, establishing self-governed territories where it collected taxes, ran local administrations, and mobilized tens of thousands of fighters. Estimates from German and Soviet intelligence placed its numbers at 25,000 to 40,000 armed men, supported by local militias and sympathizers. However, the approach of the Red Army in early 1944 posed an existential threat. The Soviets viewed the UPA as a hostile nationalist insurgency aligned with Nazi interests, while the UPA saw Soviet liberation as a reoccupation that would destroy the fragile independence it had carved out. Lopata Hill, located near the village of Lopata in the Stanislav, now Ivano-Frankivsk region, held both symbolic and strategic importance. Rising above the surrounding valleys of the Carpathian foothills, it offered control over local routes linking the mountain passes with the Dniester basin. Throughout the spring and summer of 1944, the area became a concentration point for UPA units commanded by Vasil Andrusiak, known by his nom de guerre Rizun. His formation, the Sich Division, comprised several hundred fighters equipped with light machine guns, mortars, and captured German rifles. Their primary goal was to maintain control over the approaches to the Carpathians and secure safe passage for UPA headquarters retreating deeper into the mountains. Meanwhile, the advancing Red Army, supported by NKVD internal troops, sought to eliminate any organized Ukrainian resistance before re-establishing Soviet authority. Intelligence from the First Ukrainian Front reported significant concentrations of bandit formations west of Dolina and Kalush. Orders from the NKVD directed that these areas be cleansed of nationalist elements prior to the arrival of regular Red Army units. In addition to the Soviets, remnants of the Polish underground and local self-defense militias, still active after the ethnic clashes of 1943, were also moving through the region. Lopata thus became a convergence point for multiple factions, each fighting under its own flag but within overlapping zones of hostility. In early July 1944, German forces retreating from the region left behind abandoned ammunition dumps and damaged vehicles. The UPA seized much of this materiel, strengthening its defenses. According to later Soviet reports, the insurgents constructed bunkers, trenches, and observation points on the slopes of Lopata Hill, preparing for a confrontation they knew was inevitable. Civilian populations from nearby villages were evacuated or fled voluntarily, fearing reprisals from both sides. For the local inhabitants, the line between partisan and occupier blurred completely. Loyalty was determined by survival rather than ideology. By late July, reconnaissance detachments of the NKVD's 237th Regiment began probing the area. Skirmishes broke out near Hoshiv and Losayatin, resulting in casualties on both sides. The NKVD reported encountering well-organized formations using German-type tactics, an acknowledgement of the UPA's growing professionalism. On July 30th, Soviet forces launched a coordinated assault supported by artillery and light armor, attempting to encircle the insurgents. The UPA, outnumbered but familiar with the terrain, withdrew into the forested slopes, using ambushes and flanking maneuvers to disrupt the Soviet advance. The opening clashes at Lopata marked the beginning of a brutal confrontation that would last several days. UPA units successfully repelled multiple assaults, inflicting significant casualties while suffering heavy losses themselves. Both sides fought with limited visibility amid dense pine forests and steep ridges. The terrain nullified Soviet numerical advantage and mechanized strength, turning the battle into a series of close-quarter engagements fought with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. Despite being largely isolated from external support, the insurgents' morale remained high, driven by the belief that they were defending the last bastion of a free Ukraine. As the Red Army pressed deeper into Galicia, the battle for Lopata Hill became more than a localized skirmish. It was a symbolic stand between two visions of the region's future. The Soviets saw the Carpathians as the western gate of their renewed empire, while the UPA viewed them as the final refuge of national resistance. Over the following days, this small mountain ridge would witness the convergence of history's most intractable forces, nationalism, empire, and ideology, colliding amid the forests and mist of the Carpathian frontier. In the early hours of August 1, 1944, the forested ridges surrounding Lopata Hill came alive with movement. Units of the Ukrainian insurgent army, numbering between 400 and 600 men, under Captain Vasyl Andrusiak, prepared defensive positions along the southern and eastern slopes. Trenches, foxholes, and firing points were camouflaged with pine branches. Ammunition was distributed, and local guides briefed the fighters on escape routes through the mountain ravines. The UPA had established a layered defense: forward observation posts on the high ground, machine gun nests overlooking the access roads, and mortar teams positioned behind the crest. Despite limited resources, their familiarity with the terrain offered a crucial advantage. The approaching Soviet forces, elements of the NKVD's 98th Border Regiment and internal security units, were advancing from the north and east. Their mission was straightforward: to eliminate the insurgent concentration in the Lopata sector and secure the Carpathian approaches before the main body of the First Ukrainian Front arrived. Soviet intelligence estimated the enemy's strength at up to 1,000 nationalist bandits, though their actual numbers were smaller. The NKVD operated with artillery support and carried automatic weapons, giving them superior firepower. However, logistical difficulties and limited knowledge of the terrain hampered coordination. Communication lines were unreliable, and many Soviet troops were unfamiliar with mountain warfare. The first contact occurred near the village of Losyatin at dawn. A Soviet reconnaissance platoon stumbled upon a UPA patrol and was ambushed. Within minutes, the firefight spread to nearby ridges. Reports from the Soviet side describe intense, coordinated resistance and snipers firing from treetop platforms, tactics typical of UPA's Carpathian detachments. The insurgents withdrew deliberately, drawing the enemy deeper into the forest. Once Soviet troops advanced beyond their lines, hidden machine gun positions opened fire, cutting off the rear units. By midday, the NKVD had suffered dozens of casualties and was forced to regroup under mortar fire. Meanwhile, UPA command maintained tight control through signal flares and runners. Andrusiak's second-in-command, Lieutenant Danilo Kravchuk, led the northern flank, countering Soviet attempts to outflank the main position. The insurgents' weaponry was a mix of captured German MP-40 submachine guns, Soviet PPSH-41s, and Polish Mauser rifles. Each fighter carried limited ammunition, often fewer than 90 rounds, and several grenades. Supply from nearby villages was impossible, as Soviet patrols had sealed off major access points. Nevertheless, morale remained high. Many fighters were locals defending their own valleys and had intimate knowledge of every path, creek, and slope. Throughout August 2nd, skirmishes intensified. The Soviets reinforced their positions, bringing in heavy machine guns and mortars to bombard the UPA stronghold. The forest canopy absorbed much of the shrapnel, but splinters and concussive blasts caused increasing casualties among the insurgents. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Wounded men were carried on makeshift stretchers to underground shelters. Despite the conditions, the UPA managed to maintain its defensive perimeter. Radio intercepts captured by the insurgents revealed Soviet frustration with their inability to break through. Orders from NKVD command demanded the use of flame and steel to cleanse the forest, language characteristic of anti-partisan operations across Eastern Europe. On the third day, the battle entered a new phase. Soviet artillery fire intensified, concentrating on the central ridge of Lopata Hill. Trees splintered and collapsed, filling the air with smoke and debris. UPA mortars responded sporadically, targeting the advancing infantry. The narrow ridges made maneuvering tanks impossible, forcing Soviet troops to rely on infantry assaults. By the afternoon of August 3rd, after repeated charges, the NKVD briefly captured a forward trench line but was quickly repelled by a counterattack led by Andrusiak himself. Soviet losses mounted, and field reports recorded over 70 dead and 120 wounded across 2 regiments, a significant figure for a localized engagement. The terrain turned against the Soviets as torrential rain began to fall in the late evening. Mudslides blocked mountain paths, and supply columns stalled. UPA scouts exploited the chaos, launching night raids on isolated Soviet positions, capturing weapons and destroying communication lines. A detachment of insurgents infiltrated behind enemy lines and destroyed a Soviet ammunition dump near Dolina, further disrupting operations. These actions forced the NKVD to pull back and reorganize. The Soviets now faced the dilemma of continuing a costly engagement or waiting for reinforcements from the main front. For the UPA, however, the situation was equally precarious. Ammunition reserves were nearly depleted, and food supplies had run out. Despite tactical successes, prolonged combat risked annihilation. Andrusiak convened his senior officers in a forest clearing and decided to hold Lopata Hill as long as possible before executing a phased withdrawal into the higher Carpathians. The insurgents' objective was no longer to defeat the Soviets outright, but to delay them, demonstrating the UPA's ability to resist regular forces and inspiring morale across the broader insurgency. By August 4th, both sides were exhausted. Smoke from burning trees covered the valley, and the smell of cordite mixed with rain-soaked soil. The Soviets prepared for one final assault, unaware that the UPA had already begun disengaging from the outer defenses. Small groups slipped silently through ravines, carrying their wounded and salvaging what equipment they could. When the NKVD stormed the hill the following morning, they found only empty trenches and bodies, proof of the scale and ferocity of the fight. Lopata Hill, though temporarily in Soviet hands, had become a symbol of defiance, marking one of the most organized and determined UPA operations of the entire Carpathian campaign. In the days following the battle, Soviet forces consolidated their hold over the Lopata Hill area, deploying additional NKVD regiments and engineering units to secure the ridges and establish new strongpoints. The immediate tactical outcome appeared decisive. The Red Army's left flank in the Carpathian foothills was now clear of large insurgent concentrations, yet the victory came at a high cost. Official NKVD documents reported 126 killed and 210 wounded during the engagement, though subsequent archival estimates suggest the true numbers may have been considerably higher. The terrain had made evacuation of casualties extremely difficult, forcing Soviet troops to bury their dead hastily in shallow graves near the battle site. On the Ukrainian side, the losses were severe as well. Roughly 70 killed, including several officers, and dozens wounded or captured. However, the UPA's core command structure survived intact, retreating deeper into the mountain forests. In the aftermath, the Soviet command launched a comprehensive mopping-up operation across the surrounding villages of Dolina, Goshev, and Rozhnyativ. The goal was not merely to destroy UPA remnants, but to eliminate their support network. Civilians suspected of providing food or intelligence to the insurgents were interrogated and often deported. NKVD special groups, dressed in captured UPA uniforms, infiltrated rural communities to identify sympathizers. Between August and September 1944, more than 3,000 inhabitants of the region were arrested on charges of bandit collaboration. Many were executed without trial or sent to labor camps in Siberia. The repression was systematic, intended to sever the link between the nationalist underground and the civilian population that sustained it. Despite these measures, the Carpathians proved resilient. The rugged terrain made total control impossible. Within weeks of the Soviet sweep, UPA detachments reorganized under the unified command of the Western Ukrainian Military District, also known as Voyena Okruga Halashina. The Lopata engagement had revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the insurgent army. While capable of disciplined defense and tactical innovation, it lacked the logistics to sustain open-field battles against mechanized forces. UPA command thus shifted strategy from positional defense to flexible guerrilla warfare. Fighters were dispersed into small mobile groups of 15-30 men, tasked with ambushing convoys, sabotaging communications, and assassinating NKVD officers. This adaptation marked a return to asymmetric warfare, where the terrain and local knowledge once again became decisive. For the Soviets, however, the problem of legitimacy was as significant as the military one. The Red Army presented itself as the liberator of Western Ukraine from German occupation, but in many villages, its arrival was greeted with apprehension rather than relief. The population had already endured multiple occupations, Polish, Soviet, German, each leaving scars. The reinstatement of Soviet administration in the summer of 1944 was accompanied by mass conscription, grain requisitions, and ideological re-education campaigns. The return of the NKVD resurrected memories of 1940-41, when thousands of Ukrainians had been deported to the east. Consequently, the UPA found a continued base of sympathy even after military defeat, as villagers saw the insurgents as defenders against renewed Soviet control. The battle's wider context also reflected the shifting alliances of the Eastern Front. While the Soviets advanced into Poland and Slovakia, the remnants of the German Wehrmacht maintained small garrisons in the Carpathian passes. Isolated German units occasionally clashed with both Soviet and UPA forces, though by mid-August their role was marginal. Soviet intelligence, however, often exaggerated the scale of German collaboration to justify continued anti-UPA operations. NKVD bulletins described the insurgents as agents of the German Abwehr, even though by that point the UPA was fighting all external forces on Ukrainian soil. The propaganda served both political and psychological purposes, portraying the nationalists not as patriots, but as remnants of fascism, thus legitimizing their extermination. As the autumn rains set in, the Carpathian campaign transitioned from open combat to a war of attrition. UPA fighters constructed new bunkers and caches throughout the forested valleys, while Soviet engineers built fortified outposts along key roads. Each side adapted to the other's presence. The Soviets deployed mobile blocking units supported by dogs and aircraft reconnaissance. The UPA countered with night movements, camouflage, and booby traps. Captured Soviet maps reveal that, by late 1944, the NKVD considered nearly one-third of the Carpathian region unstable. This classification justified a continued military presence and resource allocation disproportionate to the actual size of the insurgent force. Within the UPA's command, Lopata Hill became both a lesson and a legend. Reports circulated through underground publications such as Informacyjne Białystok describing the engagement as proof that disciplined Ukrainian forces could withstand Soviet regulars. The narrative emphasized heroism and sacrifice, portraying the battle as a moral victory despite material losses. In the broader propaganda war, this portrayal was vital. It boosted morale among distant UPA detachments in Volhynia, Policia, and Bukovina, reinforcing the belief that national resistance remained viable. Songs and leaflets commemorated the defenders of Lopata Hill, turning a localized military clash into a symbol of defiance against overwhelming odds. By late 1944, the Soviet government declared the Carpathian Front secured, yet in practice, the region remained a zone of continuous low-intensity conflict. UPA patrols frequently ambushed NKVD convoys, and isolated outposts were attacked under the cover of night. The dense forests and mountain villages offered perfect concealment for insurgent activity. The NKVD responded by creating destruction battalions, local paramilitary groups composed of mobilized men from nearby settlements. Their task was to guard roads, report suspicious activity, and deny the partisans freedom of movement. This system, while temporarily effective, deepened divisions within local communities. Families were split between those serving the state and those aiding the insurgency. Thus, even after the smoke of Lopata Hill had cleared, the war in the Carpathians did not end. It merely changed form. The engagement had demonstrated that neither side could achieve total control by force alone. For the UPA, it confirmed that survival depended on mobility, secrecy, and popular support. For the Soviets, it proved that conquest without consent would yield only perpetual resistance. In this uneasy stalemate, the mountains became both fortress and prison, a place where the dream of Ukrainian independence continued to burn, flickering beneath the snow and pine, waiting for the next call to arms. Through the autumn of 1944, Soviet control over the Carpathian foothills grew in strength, but so did the insurgency's adaptability. The UPA command, having learned from the losses at Lopata Hill, shifted its tactics from positional defense to dispersed guerrilla operations. The goal was no longer to hold fixed ground, but to ensure survival and continuous activity across a vast region stretching from Dolina to Verkhovina. This required reorganizing the insurgent army into smaller, autonomous cells capable of acting independently when contact with higher command was impossible. Each detachment typically consisted of 15 to 30 men, well armed with captured weapons, supported by local couriers and medical personnel. The new structure allowed the UPA to operate fluidly within hostile terrain, evading large-scale Soviet operations while maintaining offensive capability. Vasil Andrusiak, whose leadership at Lopata had made him one of the most respected commanders in the Carpathian sector, became instrumental in implementing this strategy. His unit, reconstituted as the Chorny Chorty, Black Devils Company, served as a mobile reserve, striking NKVD and Red Army supply convoys, communication lines, and local administrative centers. Reports from Soviet archives document dozens of ambushes between September and November 1944. In one attack near Perehinsky, insurgents destroyed a Soviet truck column, killing 14 soldiers and capturing several machine guns. Such actions, though small in scale, demonstrated the resilience of the UPA and its capacity to inflict steady losses on occupying forces. The NKVD responded with increased ferocity. In September, a massive sweep known as Operation Carpathian Purge was launched, involving over 8,000 internal troops and border guards. Soviet records describe a systematic grid search of mountain valleys, with detachments moving in parallel lines to encircle suspected partisan zones. Air reconnaissance was used to identify forest clearings and hidden trails. Villages were surrounded at dawn, and all male inhabitants between 16 and 50 were detained for interrogation. Those accused of aiding bandits were either executed or deported with their families. In total, the operation resulted in over 4,000 arrests, 200 confirmed insurgent deaths, and the destruction of numerous shelters and supply caches. However, despite the scale of the campaign, most UPA formations managed to withdraw intact into higher elevations or cross the ridges into neighboring regions. The psychological impact on local populations was devastating. Entire communities were caught between two forces that claimed to represent justice. The NKVD's reprisals aimed to break the will of the countryside, but often produced the opposite effect. Villagers whose homes were burned or relatives deported joined the insurgency out of desperation or vengeance. The UPA, in turn, imposed its own authority in rural areas, establishing underground administrations known as Sotny governments. These structures collected food, distributed propaganda, and enforced discipline. Punitive measures were taken against suspected collaborators, creating a climate of fear and suspicion that enveloped the region. Throughout late 1944, communication between UPA headquarters in the Carpathians and the Supreme Ukrainian Liberation Council, UHVR, in the West became increasingly difficult. The insurgency relied on couriers who traversed the mountains under constant threat from Soviet patrols. Entire cells were destroyed when ambushed by what they believed were friendly units. To counter this, Andrusiak's command issued strict verification procedures for inter-unit communication, including code phrases, regional passwords, and the use of encrypted symbols carved into trees at meeting points. The winter brought new hardships. Food shortages were acute, and many fighters suffered from frostbite and illness. Soviet blockades prevented the transport of medical supplies, forcing the UPA to rely on herbal remedies and rudimentary surgery performed in forest shelters. Yet even under these conditions, the insurgency continued to launch raids. In January 1945, a UPA detachment ambushed an NKVD convoy near Kalush, capturing documents revealing detailed plans for further pacification operations. These papers confirmed the Soviets' intention to eradicate not just armed resistance, but also the idea of Ukrainian independence itself. The discovery reinforced the insurgents' belief that surrender was impossible. In Moscow, the leadership of the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs viewed the Carpathian resistance as one of the most persistent nationalist movements in the post-war Soviet sphere. A report dated February 1945 described Western Ukraine as a region contaminated by counter-revolutionary ideology. Orders from Lavrenti Beria emphasized the need for total militarization of the region's administration. Local Soviets were staffed with vetted personnel, collective farms were militarily guarded, and transportation routes were patrolled day and night. The Soviet state sought to suffocate the rebellion through exhaustion and isolation. Yet, despite overwhelming pressure, the Carpathian UPA formations endured. Their survival was rooted not merely in military organization, but in their integration with the local environment and population. The mountains themselves functioned as an ally, concealing, sheltering, and protecting those who refused to submit. Every ravine could serve as a camp, every forest glade as a meeting place. The battle for Lopata Hill, though long over, had become a rallying cry symbolizing that the Carpathians could never be fully conquered. It was not a matter of territory anymore, but of identity. The war in the shadows continued, unseen by the wider world, but fiercely alive beneath the snow and pine. By the spring of 1945, the Soviet victory in Europe appeared inevitable. But in the forests and valleys of the Carpathians, the war showed no sign of ending. For the Ukrainian insurgent army, Germany's defeat meant the disappearance of one enemy, but the consolidation of another. The Soviet Union, now unchallenged in Eastern Europe, shifted its full attention to the internal struggle against nationalist movements. Western Ukraine was designated a special security zone, and NKVD command expanded its presence with thousands of additional troops, supported by aviation, armored cars, and local collaborators. Despite this overwhelming force, the UPA leadership refused to disband, believing that a future conflict between the Western Allies and the USSR might yet create a political opening for independence. The UPA's Carpathian command, under Vasil Andrusiak and his deputy Yuri Lopatynsky, reorganized its forces for a new phase of warfare. With open battles such as Lopata Hill no longer feasible, the insurgency focused on attrition and symbolic resistance. Intelligence gathering became a key component. Couriers infiltrated Soviet garrisons to obtain information on troop movements, while underground networks in nearby towns collected supplies and medical equipment. Local women, often overlooked by Soviet patrols, served as messengers and lookouts. Every civilian contribution, however small, carried mortal risk. NKVD field orders stipulated execution for anyone aiding bandit formations. The UPA's objectives during this phase were twofold: to maintain a continuous presence demonstrating that Soviet control was incomplete, and to protect the mountain communities from punitive operations. Insurgent patrols ambushed NKVD convoys along the Dolina-Kalush road, sabotaged telephone lines, and destroyed bridges used for troop transport. Between March and June 1945, Soviet archives recorded over 300 armed incidents in the Stanislav region alone. Each skirmish consumed resources, forced troop redeployments, and prolonged the atmosphere of insecurity. To the NKVD, the Carpathians had become a bleeding frontier, where complete pacification was perpetually just out of reach. In retaliation, Soviet forces launched one of their largest counterinsurgency efforts to date, the Spring Lightning Operation of May 1945. Over 12,000 soldiers from the NKVD's 62nd and 88th Regiments participated, supported by light tanks and aircraft conducting reconnaissance and bombing runs on suspected partisan camps. The offensive combined sweeping ground maneuvers with psychological warfare. Leaflets offering amnesty were dropped from planes, urging insurgents to surrender under promises of clemency. Simultaneously, propaganda broadcasts from local radio stations depicted the UPA as remnants of fascism, claiming they fought not for Ukraine but for foreign masters. Yet the surrender campaign yielded little. Many insurgents, aware of the fate of those who had previously surrendered, only to be executed or imprisoned, saw no reason to trust Soviet guarantees. The fighting during Spring Lightning was intense and often chaotic. UPA units, split into smaller groups, used the terrain to evade encirclement. In one engagement near the hamlet of Dovshka, a group of 40 insurgents ambushed a Soviet search column, killing 15 and disappearing before reinforcements arrived. Elsewhere, near Perehinsky, Soviet troops discovered a hidden UPA field hospital. The wounded who could not be moved were executed, and the facility was destroyed with grenades. NKVD reports described their operations as successful, but private memoranda admitted frustration. The enemy disappears into the forest and returns as if from the earth itself. Despite Soviet superiority in manpower and technology, the insurgents' endurance demonstrated that the Carpathian War was not a campaign that could be won through conventional means. As the summer of 1945 unfolded, Soviet power in western Ukraine grew more institutionalized. Collective farms were established by decree, and the population was subjected to ideological re-education. In the towns, local administrations were compelled to organize anti-bandit meetings, where villagers denounced the UPA in public. Those who refused risked deportation. Thousands of families were forcibly resettled to the east, accused of harboring sympathies for the insurgency. The demographic landscape of the Carpathian foothills began to change. Whole villages were emptied, replaced by new settlers considered politically reliable. In parallel, the NKVD intensified its intelligence efforts, recruiting informants under duress and infiltrating the UPA's courier networks. The UPA's response was increasingly political as well as military. In underground proclamations, the insurgents framed their struggle not as a rebellion, but as a continuation of Ukraine's national liberation movement. The Supreme Ukrainian Liberation Council, UHVR, acting as a provisional political authority, issued declarations appealing to the international community. They argued that the Soviet Union's annexation of Western Ukraine was illegal and demanded recognition of Ukrainian sovereignty at post-war conferences. These appeals went unanswered, but they served an internal purpose, reinforcing the belief among the rank and file that their sacrifices were part of a historic mission, not a doomed resistance. In this period, the memory of Lapata Hill acquired near-mythical status. It was invoked in speeches, songs, and leaflets as evidence that Ukrainians had once stood face-to-face with the Red Army and endured. The names of fallen commanders were recited during swearing ceremonies for new recruits. While Soviet propaganda dismissed the battle as a minor police action, the UPA turned it into a cornerstone of its identity. It symbolized not victory, but defiance, proof that Ukrainian fighters could resist even the most powerful empire in Europe. The spirit of Lopata was invoked whenever morale faltered, binding the scattered detachments into a single moral front. By late 1945, it was clear that the UPA could not defeat the Soviets militarily, yet it refused to vanish. Its strength now lay in its persistence, in the ability to exist as both movement and idea. Soviet security officers understood this dilemma well. One internal report concluded, "We have won the territory, but not the people. The mountains conceal not only the bandits, but the thought of freedom." This recognition haunted Soviet planners, forcing them to maintain large garrisons in the region for years. Thus, even as the Great War in Europe ended, the Carpathians remained ablaze with a conflict unseen by most of the world. It was a struggle without front lines or truces, where identity itself had become the battlefield. The UPA's battle for Lopata Hill had long passed, but its echo continued to shape the war that followed, a war fought not for ground, but for the right to exist as a nation beneath the shadow of empire. The winter of 1945-46 descended upon the Carpathians with brutal intensity. Snow covered the battle-scarred ridges of Lopata and the nearby valleys, burying the traces of recent warfare, but not the conflict itself. The Ukrainian insurgent army faced its hardest season since the movement's inception. Supplies were nearly exhausted, and Soviet counterinsurgency operations left little room for regrouping. Yet, despite hunger, cold, and attrition, the UPA refused to dissolve. Its presence persisted through isolated strongholds scattered across the mountains, small bunkers dug into slopes, camouflaged camps hidden beneath frozen spruce, and networks of underground shelters linking villages that still dared to support them. The NKVD, now reorganized into the Ministry of State Security, MGB, intensified its operations with renewed precision. Soviet command recognized that conventional sweeps had failed. Therefore, 1946 marked a transition toward infiltration, deception, and psychological warfare. The MGB established special agent combat groups that posed as insurgent detachments. These units, often composed of captured or coerced former UPA fighters, infiltrated mountain settlements under false flags. They conducted assassinations, plundered homes, and terrorized civilians, acts later blamed on the UPA itself. The objective was clear: to destroy the insurgents' moral standing and isolate them from their support base. The strategy proved devastatingly effective, spreading confusion and distrust among the population that had long served as the insurgency's lifeline. Amid these operations, the UPA command under Vasil Andrusiak struggled to maintain cohesion. By early 1946, his forces had been reduced to small, scattered groups of exhausted men. Still, they continued to strike where opportunity allowed. A successful ambush near Broshnev in February eliminated a Soviet convoy transporting captured insurgents to Ivano-Frankivsk. The UPA rescued 11 prisoners and seized a cache of weapons and ammunition. Yet each such victory came at immense cost. Within weeks, Soviet reinforcements descended upon the surrounding forest, conducting mass arrests and burning suspected hideouts. Entire villages such as Vihoda and Strimba were evacuated, and their populations deported to Siberia as collective punishment. The insurgents' endurance was sustained by discipline and ideology rather than hope of victory. The underground publication Povstansky Shliak circulated essays describing the struggle as part of a long war of nations enslaved by Moscow. Fighters were urged to see themselves not as isolated remnants, but as the vanguard of a broader liberation yet to come. This ideological framing was crucial. It kept morale intact even as physical conditions deteriorated. The UPA's leadership continued to issue directives emphasizing political education, prohibition of theft, and strict behavior toward civilians, a deliberate effort to contrast their movement with the brutality of Soviet forces. In the spring of 1946, the MGB launched another massive campaign, codenamed Operation Triangle. Nearly 18,000 troops from internal security divisions, supported by local militia and aviation, encircled the region south of Dolina and west of Kalush. Their goal was to capture Andrusiak's command center, believed to be hidden in the ravines near Lopata Hill. Air reconnaissance identified several smoke plumes suspected to be partisan camps, prompting heavy bombardment. Artillery rained shells across forested slopes, destroying dozens of shelters. However, the insurgents had already moved higher into the mountains, anticipating the attack. For 2 weeks, Soviet units advanced through waist-deep snow, finding only abandoned camps, burned documents, and empty bunkers. The terrain turned against them once again. Blizzards cut off supply lines, and frostbite incapacitated hundreds of soldiers. Andrusiak's last recorded engagement occurred in February 1946, near the village of Dovparik. His detachment, numbering fewer than 40 men, was surrounded by Soviet troops during a surprise raid. Refusing to surrender, the insurgents broke through the encirclement, but suffered catastrophic losses. Andrusiak himself was gravely wounded and captured shortly thereafter. According to MGB records, he died under interrogation in March 1946. His death marked the end of organized Carpathian command, though isolated cells continued operating for years. The MGB buried his body in an unmarked grave, an attempt to erase both the man and the symbol he represented. Yet his legend endured, preserved in underground songs and memoirs smuggled through the forests. With Andrusiak gone, the remaining UPA formations in the Carpathians came under decentralized leadership. Communication with higher command in Volhynia and Galicia became sporadic. Nevertheless, local commanders like Mikhailo Stepaniak, Skala, and Ivan Butkovsky, Hutsul, continued guerrilla operations. Their forces targeted Soviet transport routes, assassinated collaborators, and sabotaged collective farm initiatives. These actions were small in scale but symbolically potent, demonstrating that the flame of resistance still burned even as Soviet rule solidified across the region. The Soviet state, determined to extinguish that flame, expanded its counterinsurgency network beyond the military sphere. Cultural institutions, schools, and the press were mobilized to delegitimize the nationalist movement. New textbooks portrayed the UPA as traitors and murderers, erasing any distinction between them and Nazi collaborators. Soviet films depicted NKVD officers as heroes, liberating the countryside from chaos. This propaganda campaign, combined with decades of repression, shaped collective memory for generations. Many rural families concealed their wartime experiences, fearing persecution. The silence became a survival mechanism, one that would endure long after the last shot was fired. By late 1946, the Carpathian Rebellion had entered its twilight phase. The number of active insurgents dwindled to fewer than 2,000 across the broader region. Food shortages, desertions, and constant pursuit forced many to hide as civilians or flee abroad. Yet even as the movement weakened militarily, its symbolic weight grew. The UPA's battle for Lopata Hill and the years of forest warfare that followed became part of a larger historical continuum, one linking the interwar struggle for independence to future aspirations of national sovereignty. In the eyes of the Soviet authorities, the campaign had succeeded. Western Ukraine was once again firmly under Moscow's control. But for the people who had lived through it, the victory felt hollow. The forests were quiet now, yet beneath the snow and the centuries-old pines lay the remnants of a conflict that refused to disappear. A war of conviction that had outlasted empires, commanders, and even hope itself. The year 1947 marked a decisive transformation in the struggle that had once defined the Carpathian Front. The major battles were over, the organized commands of the Ukrainian insurgent army had been dismantled, yet the conflict persisted in another form, an underground war of survival. Soviet power now extended across every administrative and social structure of Western Ukraine, but its dominance was maintained only through continuous pressure. Entire regions remained classified as zones of heightened vigilance, and internal troops of the Ministry of State Security were permanently stationed in mountain districts. For the authorities in Moscow and Kyiv, The elimination of the UPA was no longer just a military task. It had become a test of ideological control over a territory still viewed with suspicion. In early 1947, the MGB initiated a series of operations designed to root out what they termed bandit remnants. These campaigns were as much psychological as physical. Newly formed destruction battalions, drawn from local conscripts, were ordered to patrol remote valleys and enforce total surveillance. Villagers were forced to register every visitor, surrender all hunting weapons, and attend mandatory political meetings. The presence of any unregistered person in a household was punishable by imprisonment. This constant monitoring created a state of fear that isolated the remaining insurgents. Without civilian assistance, food and intelligence became almost impossible to obtain. Nevertheless, the UPA's spirit endured in fragmented detachments scattered throughout the Carpathian ranges. Groups of 5 to 10 men, often lacking uniforms or consistent communication, continued to strike Soviet outposts. One such action occurred near Yaremche in March 1947, when insurgents ambushed a police patrol, seizing weapons and documents before vanishing into the forests. Soviet reprisals were swift. Within days, the surrounding villages were sealed off, and over 200 residents were detained for questioning. Similar incidents played out across the region, creating a rhythm of resistance and retaliation that kept the mountains tense even in the absence of large-scale battles. The year also saw the consolidation of Soviet deportation policies aimed at depopulating insurgent strongholds. Operation Zapad, West, launched in October 1947, represented one of the largest forced resettlements in the post-war USSR. Over 76,000 people from western Ukraine were deported to Siberia and Kazakhstan within a matter of weeks, accused of aiding nationalist formations. Entire families were transported in sealed cattle cars, often with only a few hours' notice. Local records show that nearly every village in the Dolina and Kalish districts lost between 10 and 20% of its inhabitants. The operation achieved its goal. It deprived the UPA of its logistical base, and it broke the back of civilian support networks that had sustained the movement for 5 years. For the insurgents who remained, survival meant adapting once again. Underground bunkers grew more sophisticated, some equipped with ventilation pipes disguised as tree roots and secret exits leading into ravines. Radio communication was nearly abandoned to avoid detection. Instead, couriers carried handwritten reports across treacherous mountain passes, sometimes traveling for weeks between detachments. Leadership structures were deliberately decentralized. No commander held detailed knowledge of more than one district. This compartmentalization limited the damage of Soviet infiltrations, but also eroded strategic coherence. By mid-1947, the UPA was no longer a unified army, but a network of small autonomous resistance cells. The political dimension of the struggle shifted as well. The Supreme Ukrainian Liberation Council, UHVR, operating clandestinely, sought to maintain the legitimacy of the insurgency in the eyes of the population. Leaflets and proclamations continued to appear in villages, denouncing Soviet collectivization and the persecution of the Church. These appeals framed the conflict as part of a broader European confrontation between freedom and totalitarianism. However, for most villagers, the rhetoric was overshadowed by exhaustion and fear. Years of war, arrests, and deportations had drained the countryside of its will to resist. Cooperation with the underground, once widespread, became rare. The few who still aided the insurgents did so out of loyalty or desperation, knowing the penalty for discovery was death or exile. Soviet propaganda, meanwhile, declared victory. Newspapers published stories of captured bandits who allegedly confessed to crimes against civilians. Public trials were staged in regional centers like Stanislav and Stry, complete with forced testimonies and denunciations. The regime used these spectacles to portray the UPA as an extinct relic, a warning against disobedience. Yet internal reports from the MGB painted a different picture. As late as autumn 1947, armed clashes were still occurring weekly, and over 1,000 insurgents were believed to remain active across western Ukraine. Many operated independently, without communication with Central Command, sustained only by faith in the cause and the hope that history would one day vindicate them. The repression extended beyond the battlefield into every facet of daily life. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which had offered moral and logistical support to the nationalist movement, was outlawed in March 1946 and fully suppressed by 1947. Its clergy were arrested or forced to join the Russian Orthodox Church under Soviet control. Monasteries were raided, and underground seminaries were dismantled. The destruction of the church dealt a psychological blow to the population, severing another link between national identity and spiritual authority. By the end of 1947, the Carpathians were quieter than they had been in years, but this calm was deceptive. The forests were filled with the remnants of bunkers, the ruins of burned villages, and the scattered graves of both insurgents and civilians. The UPA's organized presence had been reduced to a shadow, but that shadow still carried the memory of resistance. For the Soviet administration, complete pacification required not only the elimination of fighters, but the erasure of memory itself. To that end, the authorities began renaming villages, removing nationalist monuments, and replacing local folklore with officially approved Soviet narratives. The Carpathian Rebellion was to be forgotten, its names and battles buried beneath layers of ideology and silence. Preventive arrests became routine. Anyone who once served as a courier, provided food, or had a relative in the UPA could be detained indefinitely. By late 1948, over 40,000 people from the Ivano-Frankivsk region alone had been imprisoned or deported. In official reports, the MGB described the operation as the final stage of bandit liquidation. Yet behind this bureaucratic phrase was a systematic erasure of an entire social class, the independent-minded rural population that had resisted both Soviet and Nazi domination. Meanwhile, small remnants of insurgent groups still survived in isolation, living in mountain hideouts, abandoned barns, or beneath false identities in nearby towns. Their numbers were minute, perhaps a few hundred across all of western Ukraine, but their persistence continued to unsettle the Soviet authorities. History textbooks written in the late 1940s described the events in western Ukraine as the elimination of fascist remnants, crediting the NKVD and local communist cadres for restoring socialist order. Public monuments honored Red Army soldiers who had liberated the Carpathians, while any mention of Ukrainian insurgents was banned. Families of fallen UPA fighters were labeled as traitor kin, denied access to higher education or government employment. The purpose was not merely to punish, but to erase, to ensure that the idea of the insurgency would fade into obscurity. Yet in private, the memory remained alive. In mountain villages, people continued to whisper the names of local commanders during commemorations of All Saints' Day, lighting candles at unmarked graves. For every erased monument, another was built in silence, marked only by a wooden cross hidden among trees. The repression extended to culture and religion. The outlawed Greek Catholic Church, forced underground since 1946, became the last institutional refuge for those who refused to conform. Secret liturgies were held in barns or forest chapels, often attended by former insurgents or their relatives. Priests moved from village to village under assumed names, hearing confessions and preserving the moral memory of the resistance. The Soviet state, unable to root out faith entirely, instead tried to co-opt it. Official Orthodox clergy were instructed to preach loyalty to the government and condemn nationalist deviation. Still, in the hearts of many, the Church remained inseparable from the idea of Ukraine, and thus from the legacy of those who had died at Lapata Hill. By the late 1940s, the balance of fear had shifted. The population no longer expected liberation from the West, and the insurgents no longer dreamed of victory. Yet neither side achieved full peace. For the Soviet state, such discoveries were trophies, proof that no enemy, however small, could escape the reach of its power. While the last fighters disappeared into prisons or graves, Soviet policy turned toward reshaping the land itself. The collectivization campaign, completed in the western oblasts by 1950, uprooted the traditional village economy that had sustained the insurgents. Private farms were abolished, and collective fields were reorganized under state supervision. Peasants who had once hidden partisans now worked under watchful eyes, surrounded by propaganda banners extolling the unity of Soviet peoples. The forests were no longer refugees but resources. Timber was harvested, new roads carved through once remote valleys, and the geography of resistance literally dismantled. Lopata Hill, the site of the famous battle 5 years earlier, was stripped of its trenches and turned into grazing land. In Soviet maps, the location was marked simply as Elevation 958, its history erased. Yet beneath this imposed uniformity, fragments of the past endured. Families of fallen insurgents maintained secret rituals, gathering in the forest each year on the anniversary of a relative's death. They planted small crosses, left offerings, and recited prayers that could not be spoken publicly. Some preserved photographs or letters hidden beneath floorboards or in jars buried under apple trees. Every such act was a quiet defiance, a refusal to let memory die even when history had been rewritten. The punishment for discovery was severe: imprisonment under Article 54 of the Criminal Code for anti-Soviet agitation. But in a society built on silence, even whispering the names of the dead became an act of resistance. Abroad, the émigré Ukrainian community worked to preserve what the Soviet Union sought to suppress. Many of them lived under assumed names, working as laborers, teachers, or factory workers, while concealing their pasts from even their children. In state archives, their names appeared only as rehabilitated posthumously, bureaucratic absolution without acknowledgement of the truth. The Soviet narrative of bandit liquidation remained official dogma. Museums, schoolbooks, and documentaries celebrated the Red Army's liberation of Western Ukraine, while the existence of Ukrainian armed resistance was reduced to a footnote, condemned as collaborationist activity. But history, even when buried, has a way of resurfacing. In the quiet of mountain villages, elders told stories to their grandchildren about the men of the forest. They spoke of nights when red flares lit the sky above Lopata Hill, of soldiers who sang hymns before battle, of the women who risked everything to bring them bread. These tales passed through generations not as political lessons but as parables of endurance. They taught that freedom had been fought for even when it was lost, that dignity could survive where victory did not. The Soviet state could change textbooks, but it could not extinguish folklore. By the early 1950s, the Carpathian region appeared fully integrated into the Soviet Union. Electricity reached remote villages, collective farms operated efficiently, and new roads connected the highlands to industrial centers. Yet for those who had lived through the Forest War, the modern landscape seemed haunted. Beneath the asphalt and settlements lay unmarked graves, insurgents, civilians, and soldiers alike. No memorials marked the battlefields. Even speaking of them was dangerous. Lopata Hill remained absent from official histories until the late 1980s, but among the people, its name endured like a secret password, invoked in songs that had no author and in prayers whispered beneath the pines. The Soviet victory was complete in form, but hollow in spirit. Historians and journalists within Ukraine quietly started to re-examine the events of the 1940s, accessing long-sealed archives and interviewing surviving witnesses. Some veterans of the UPA, living under false names for 40 years, began to speak. Their recollections revealed a war far more complex than propaganda allowed, a war of tragedy, conviction, and impossible choices. In 1988, during the era of glasnost, local newspapers in Ivano-Frankivsk published cautious articles mentioning the partisan battles near Lopata Hill, describing them as a tragic chapter of the national past. For the first time in living memory, the subject could be discussed publicly without immediate fear of imprisonment. When Ukraine declared independence in 1991, the story of the UPA returned to the surface. Formerly secret archives were opened, memorials erected, and historical commissions established to reassess the insurgency. Lopata Hill thus became not only a historical site, but a stage for modern debates about identity, loyalty, and truth. Each generation revisited the battle with new questions. Were the insurgents freedom fighters or doomed idealists? Was their struggle necessary or tragic? The answers varied, but the conversation itself, long forbidden, was a form of vindication. The silence had finally been broken. Today, the slopes of Lopata Hill are quiet once more. Pine forests have reclaimed the scars of war, and memorial crosses rise where trenches once cut into the earth. Every July, small groups of historians, veterans, descendants, and locals gather to lay flowers and light candles. They speak not of victory, but of remembrance, of endurance in the face of annihilation. The battle that began as a desperate defense in 1944 has become a symbol of continuity, linking past generations of Ukrainians in their quest for dignity and self-determination.